December 1944, Ardennes, Belgium. The 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit, rolls into the snow-dusted forests, ready to face the harsh reality of the Battle of the Bulge. Despite being outnumbered and underestimated, their resolve is unwavering. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, they advance through the frigid landscape, unaware that they are about to disrupt the German war machine's momentum. The Germans, confident in their panzer divisions and their battle-hardened soldiers, view the Americans as a mere obstacle, dismissing the black tankers as inferior. The 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by SS Standartenführer Sepp Dietrich, positions its tanks in what they believe is a fortified area of superiority, anticipating a swift victory. They have faced similar scenarios before, and this time would be no different until the American tanks open fire. The 761st's M4 Shermans engage the Germans head-on, charging through the terrain with relentless determination. The first shot strikes true, and the German Tiger tank is hit with an explosive force, instantly disabling it. The silence that follows is deafening. In an instant, the Germans, who had expected to crush the American forces, now find themselves caught off guard, staring at the remains of their prized heavy tank. The Germans scramble, their plans falling apart as the 761st tanks reload and prepare for the next wave. German commanders radio orders to reposition, but it's too late. The shock reverberates through their ranks, and the myth of German invincibility begins to crumble. The M4 Shermans, often underestimated, stand their ground as a symbol of unexpected resilience. For a few moments there is nothing but the eerie quiet of the forest. The men of the 761st remain focused, their training kicking in. The battlefield may be quiet for now, but the echoes of that first strike will linger long after the sound of the battle subsides. December 1944, Ardennes, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was in full swing. The German army, despite its dwindling resources, had launched a last-ditch counter-offensive to reclaim territory and disrupt the Allied advance. This was their final opportunity to turn the tide in the west. The 1st SS Panzer Division, one of the elite armoured units of the Wehrmacht, was leading the charge, confident that their formidable heavy tanks, particularly the Tiger, would give them the edge they needed. Under the command of SS Standartenführer Sepp Dietrich, they believed their superior armour and experienced crews could push the Allies back and buy more time for Nazi Germany. But the reality was far bleaker for the Germans. Fuel shortages, a lack of fresh troops, and mounting losses from months of heavy fighting had severely weakened the German war effort. The myth of the Tiger tank, which had once been a symbol of invincibility, was starting to crack under the weight of logistical challenges. German morale was low, but the psychological impact of their tanks and elite divisions still gave them a sense of superiority. On the other side, the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit of the U.S. Army, was facing its own challenges. After months of brutal fighting in Italy, they had been rushed into Belgium without the chance to rest or recover. They were exhausted, their equipment was worn down, and they had been thrown into the heart of one of the most intense battles of the war. Despite all of this, they knew that their success in the Ardennes was critical. The 761st, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, was ready to fight, even though they had been under continuous fire for weeks and had yet to see any relief. The stakes were enormous. If the Allies failed to break the German lines, the war would drag on much longer, costing thousands of lives and giving Germany more time to regroup. The 761st's mission was clear. They had to hold the line and force a German retreat. Both sides were at a crossroads. For the Germans, the Tiger tank was the key to maintaining their position. The belief that one tank could halt a whole division was deeply ingrained in their military strategy. But the reality of war was much harsher. German armour, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now becoming a liability. The German command believed that their elite tank units, including the Tigers, could withstand anything the Allies threw at them, but they were failing to recognize the changing tide of the war. Their armoured divisions, already stretched thin, could not withstand the constant pressure from the American forces. For the 761st, this battle was more than just another engagement. It was a moment to prove their worth in a war where they had often been relegated to the periphery. The fact that they were an all-black unit made their presence on the front lines even more significant. They had been dismissed by many, both within the army and outside of it, as being inferior to their white counterparts. Yet they had fought bravely in previous engagements, and now in the Ardennes they had the opportunity to show the world what they were capable of. The success of the 761st would not only impact the outcome of the battle, but could also shift the perception of black soldiers in the military. The American objective in the Ardennes was to halt the German counteroffensive and drive them back. It wasn't just about holding ground, it was about crushing the German myth of invincibility and breaking their resolve. If they succeeded, the Allies could secure a quicker victory and shorten the war, preventing even more lives from being lost. Failure, however, meant that the Germans could regain their footing, prolonging the war and causing further devastation. The outcome of the battle wasn't just a tactical decision, it would determine how the final months of the war would unfold. The tension was palpable on both sides. The German forces, despite their material advantages, were beginning to feel the weight of their mistakes. The myth of the Tiger tank, once an icon of fear, was beginning to crack. Meanwhile, the 761st, though battle-worn and under-equipped, were ready to do whatever it took to prove themselves. They knew the stakes they were fighting not only for victory but for respect and recognition. The weight of history rested on their shoulders. The outcome of the battle would not only shape the course of the war, but could also shift the perception of black soldiers in the eyes of the American public and military establishment. As the tanks rumbled forward, both sides were aware of the stakes. The Germans, confident in their tanks and their strategic advantage, believed they would win the day. The 761st, aware of their challenges, understood that this battle was far from a typical engagement. Every shot fired, every decision made would have consequences that rippled far beyond the front lines. The battle in the Ardennes was more than just a fight for territory. It was a fight for the very future of the war itself. The Germans were fighting to hold on to their last hopes of victory, while the Americans were fighting to break the German hold on Europe once and for all. As the two forces closed in on each other, it was clear that the battle would be fierce. But what neither side could predict was the outcome of this engagement, and how it would challenge everything they thought they knew about warfare, about each other, and about the soldiers on the front lines. The 761st was ready to face whatever came their way, knowing that the fate of the war could depend on their actions. The German tanks, particularly the iconic Tiger I and Panther, had been symbols of fear and invincibility across Europe. With their powerful 88mm guns and thick armor, they were unmatched on the open battlefield. However, the conditions of the Ardennes forest, dense woods and narrow, muddy roads created significant challenges for the German forces. The Tigers, despite their firepower, were not built for such terrain. Their weight made maneuvering difficult, and their massive size left them vulnerable to hit-and-run tactics employed by the Americans. These tanks, which had once dominated the battlefield, were now becoming liabilities in close combat, where speed and agility were more important than sheer firepower. As the Americans advanced, they were armed with the M4 Sherman, a tank that, while lighter and less powerful than the German heavy tanks, was far more mobile and versatile. The Sherman's 75mm gun was effective at close range and had the advantage of rapid-fire capability, allowing American crews to deliver consistent damage to the Germans. While the Sherman's armor could not withstand direct hits from the German 88mm guns, its mobility allowed it to avoid direct confrontations, using terrain to outmaneuver the slower German tanks. The Sherman's shortcomings, particularly its relatively thin armor and weaker gun, had been a concern since the beginning of the war. But American tank crews quickly adapted, learning how to exploit the German tanks' weaknesses. In a series of engagements across the Ardennes, the American forces demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics. Sherman tanks would often coordinate with infantry, artillery, and air support, setting traps and ambushes for German tanks that were too slow to react in time. This allowed the American tanks to survive engagements that on paper they had no business winning. Despite their early successes, the American forces knew they needed something more to counter the German tanks head-on. The solution came in the form of the M26, Pershing, a heavy tank, armed with a powerful 90mm gun capable of penetrating the thick armor of the Tiger I and Panther. However, the Pershing was not available in large numbers at the time, and its limited presence on the battlefield meant that the bulk of the fighting was still left to the Shermans. Despite the technological gap, the Shermans proved effective when used in coordination with other assets. German forces, on the other hand, had little room for error. While their tanks were formidable, their logistical problems were mounting. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and a lack of spare parts made it difficult for the Germans to maintain their tanks in the field. The Tigers and Panthers, once feared for their unstoppable firepower, were often immobilized by simple mechanical failures or logistical bottlenecks. This was particularly evident during the harsh winter months in the Ardennes, where the cold exacerbated existing issues with engine reliability and tank mobility. American forces, with their superior industrial capacity, were able to replace losses at a much faster rate. The mass production of Sherman tanks and the continuous flow of supplies ensured that the American forces were able to sustain their offensive. This logistical advantage gave the Allies a significant edge over the Germans, whose tanks were increasingly difficult to replace. The Germans could not afford to lose their Tiger tanks. Each one that was destroyed represented a significant loss in both material and morale. While the German tanks still had their strengths, their strategic vulnerability was becoming more apparent. The reliance on heavy tanks, combined with a lack of resources and an inability to adapt to the changing nature of tank warfare, left the Germans in a precarious position. The flexibility and adaptability of the American forces, backed by superior production and logistics, allowed them to maintain the pressure on the Germans even in the most difficult conditions. As the battle in the Ardennes unfolded, it became clear that the Americans were learning quickly. They adapted to the limitations of their tanks and exploited the weaknesses of their enemies. German tanks, once seen as unbeatable, were now struggling to keep up with the rapidly evolving tactics of the American forces. The outcome of this battle would not be determined by the raw power of the tanks alone, but by the ability to adapt to exploit weaknesses and to use the terrain and the environment to one's advantage. This adaptability was what ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. Inside the German tanks, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The Tiger crews, seasoned and confident, had fought across Europe, their tanks feared for their thick armor and powerful 88mm guns. They were used to engaging at long ranges where their firepower could decimate enemy armor from a distance. But in the dense, snow-covered Ardennes, things were different. The terrain was unfamiliar, the narrow roads and forests presenting obstacles that hindered their maneuverability. The usual advantage of firepower over mobility was now being tested. As the battle raged, the crews began to realize the American tanks weren't reacting as expected. The Shermans, despite being lighter and less powerful, were quick and agile, darting through the trees and outflanking the German positions. The first shot fired at a Sherman rattled the crew, but it didn't bring the expected result. The Sherman didn't break apart as easily as they had been led to believe. Instead, it responded with quick, accurate fire, striking the Tiger before the crew could react. The usual confidence of the German crews faltered. Each hit felt like a shock, not just to the tank, but to their morale. They were accustomed to dominating the battlefield, but the Shermans were forcing them into a new kind of warfare. The familiar sound of their 88mm guns firing, once a source of terror for their enemies, seemed to be less effective. The Shermans, despite their thinner armor, were proving to be elusive targets. In the heat of the battle, the Germans began to experience moments of doubt. A Tiger tank, having just fired a round at an approaching Sherman, was struck by return fire. The blast from the Sherman's 75mm gun ripped into the Tiger's side, and the crew scrambled to assess the damage. They were trained to expect quick victories, but now they found themselves struggling to keep up with the speed and precision of the American tanks. The Tiger, once an indomitable force, now felt vulnerable, and the crew inside began to understand that their time of dominance was over. On the American side, the crews inside the Sherman tanks moved with cold efficiency. The roar of their engines, the steady hum of their radios, the crackle of the comms, everything was part of the relentless march forward. They knew they were at a disadvantage, that their tanks were outgunned and out-armored by the Germans, but they had something the German crews didn't: speed and adaptability. The Americans relied on hit-and-run tactics, constantly repositioning, always staying one step ahead of the German forces. They used the terrain to their advantage, moving swiftly through the woods, taking cover behind trees and rocks, firing only when they had the perfect shot. When the first shell struck a German tank, the American crew didn't celebrate. There was no moment of triumph, no time for that. They simply executed their next move. Their training was ingrained. Identify the target, take the shot, move again. The battle was a relentless series of steps, and every shot fired brought them one step closer to victory. Inside the Shermans, the crews stayed focused. They knew the German tanks were formidable, but they also knew that with the right tactics they could survive. The sound of the 75mm guns firing was like a steady heartbeat in the chaos of battle, a rhythm that pushed them forward. The battlefield was a blur of smoke, fire, and shouts over the radio, but the crews never lost their calm. Each tank was a machine, and they were simply parts of that machine working together to accomplish the mission. When a Sherman was hit, the crew didn't panic. They moved with precision, following their training to assess the damage, calculate their next move, and continue the fight. Every hit was a reminder of the stakes. They were in a battle for survival, and they couldn't afford mistakes. They didn't have the luxury of heroism, only the cold efficiency of soldiers who knew they had to adapt or perish. The Germans, with their larger, more powerful tanks, had the edge in firepower, but the Americans had learned that in a battle of mobility, precision, and coordination, they could make the Germans bleed. The German crews began to realize that their superiority in armor and firepower was being slowly undermined by the Americans' ability to adapt. The speed of the Shermans, combined with the overwhelming support of airstrikes and artillery, was wearing down the German resolve. Their tanks, once feared across Europe, were being outmaneuvered and destroyed in ways they hadn't anticipated. The myth of the German tank's invincibility began to crack as the Americans proved that speed, coordination, and relentless pressure could overcome even the most powerful machines of war. For the Americans, this was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight to prove that they could overcome the odds. The 761st Tank Battalion, despite being outnumbered and facing a formidable opponent, pushed forward with a singular purpose. They had no time to dwell on their disadvantages. Every tank they destroyed, every German tank that burned on the battlefield, was a testament to their adaptability, their innovation, and their sheer will to win. As the battle continued, both sides understood that this was not just a test of firepower, it was a test of endurance, of who could adapt faster and who could outlast the other. The American forces, though initially at a disadvantage, were proving that innovation, speed, and tactics could win the day. For the Germans, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Their tanks, once symbols of their might, were becoming expensive targets that they couldn't afford to lose. The tide of battle had shifted, and it was clear that the Americans were now in control. By late 1944, the Americans had begun to adapt to the realities of fighting German armor. Early encounters with the German tanks, particularly the formidable Tiger and Panther, had exposed the limitations of the M4 Sherman, which was underpowered in comparison. However, as the battles raged on, the Americans learned quickly, adjusting their tactics and improving their ability to deal with these superior tanks. They had no choice but to adapt or risk being overwhelmed. Initially, the Shermans were not equipped to face the heavy firepower of the Tigers and Panthers. Their 75mm guns were simply not capable of penetrating the thick armor of these German tanks at long ranges. The U.S. Army, however, quickly recognized this weakness and took action. The introduction of the 76mm gun on the Sherman, though still not a match for the 88mm gun of the Tiger, significantly increased the tank's ability to engage German armor effectively, particularly at closer ranges. Additionally, the Pershing tank, with its powerful 90mm gun, was introduced later in 1944, marking a significant step in the U.S. Army's ability to fight on equal terms with German tanks. Despite the limitations of the Sherman, the Americans began to exploit their tanks' superior mobility and the tactics that came with it. The Germans, relying on the brute force of their tanks, were slow to adjust. The American strategy was to use speed, surprise, and coordination with air and artillery support to counter the superior German tanks. The Shermans would often move in groups, outflanking and hitting the German tanks from unexpected angles. The infantry would advance alongside them, providing support and acting as a shield for the vulnerable tanks. This approach turned out to be highly effective. The Germans, who had become accustomed to fighting in open terrain, were now faced with a new kind of battle in the dense forests of the Ardennes. Their Tigers and Panthers, while powerful, were cumbersome in such terrain. The German tanks could easily destroy a Sherman in a head-on confrontation, but they struggled when faced with the agility and coordination of the American forces. The Americans used the terrain to their advantage, often forcing the Germans into positions where their superior firepower and armor were less effective. The initial German success was partly due to their tanks' formidable firepower and armor. The Tigers, in particular, could destroy a Sherman from long distances, and their thick armor made them nearly invulnerable to most Allied guns. However, the Germans had not anticipated the effectiveness of the American tactics or the quick adaptation of the U.S. forces. As the battle in the Ardennes continued, the Americans began to learn how to exploit the weaknesses of the German tanks. The Sherman's mobility, combined with the ability to quickly reposition, allowed them to outmaneuver the German tanks, negating their advantages in firepower and armor. The Americans also learned to coordinate their attacks more effectively. The presence of air support, particularly from the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang, helped turn the tide in favor of the Allies. These aircraft would often target the German tanks from above, hitting them where they were most vulnerable. The artillery support, meanwhile, softened up the German positions before the tanks moved in. This combination of tank mobility, air support, and artillery fire gave the Americans a significant advantage, even though their tanks were still outgunned in direct engagements. In contrast, the Germans, despite their technological superiority, struggled to adapt. The logistics of keeping their tanks in action were becoming increasingly difficult. Their tanks, particularly the Tiger and Panther, were prone to mechanical failures, and the cold weather in the Ardennes only exacerbated these issues. The Germans, who had long relied on the power of their tanks, found themselves fighting a battle they could not win. Their tanks, despite their firepower, were not invincible, and their crews began to realize this as the battle wore on. The once feared Tigers were now immobilized by mechanical breakdowns and supply shortages, leaving the Germans with few options but to retreat. The U.S. Army's ability to adapt, innovate, and rapidly deploy new tactics and technology was a key factor in the success of the Allied forces. The quick adaptation to the realities of tank warfare, combined with the American ability to replace losses quickly, meant that the Germans could not sustain their advantage. The Germans, despite their superior tanks, were becoming bogged down in a war of attrition they could not afford. The Americans, on the other hand, were able to absorb losses and continue to press forward using their superior industrial capacity to replace tanks and equipment at a rate the Germans simply could not match. The lessons learned in the Ardennes battle were crucial for the Allies' success in the later stages of the war. The U.S. Army had proven that it could adapt to any situation, learning quickly from its mistakes and using innovation to overcome the technological advantages of the Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, had become trapped by their own reliance on heavy tanks and outdated tactics. The shift in balance from German dominance to Allied superiority was now undeniable. The American ability to exploit German weaknesses both on the battlefield and in logistics marked a turning point in the war. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was not just a battle of tanks, it was a battle of strategies, and the Americans proved that they could outthink and outfight the Germans at every turn. Despite their technological disadvantage, the U.S. Army's adaptability and the ability to rapidly implement new tactics and equipment proved to be the decisive factors in the victory. The Germans, with their aging and strained resources, could no longer keep up. The myth of the German tank's invincibility had been ingrained in the minds of both the Germans and their enemies for years. The Tigers and Panthers were seen as the ultimate weapon of war, their thick armor and powerful 88mm guns considered unbeatable. The Germans had relied on the psychological impact of their tanks, knowing that their sheer presence could cause fear and hesitation in enemy ranks. They were the pride of the Wehrmacht, and their reputation had been built through countless engagements where they dominated the battlefield. But in the dense forests of the Ardennes, this reputation was about to crumble. As the battle unfolded, the once feared German tanks began to show their weaknesses. Despite their heavy armor, the Tigers and Panthers were slow and cumbersome in the tight wooded terrain. Their size made it difficult to maneuver, and their engines, already stretched to their limits, began to fail. The cold of the Ardennes winter exacerbated these mechanical issues, and the once invincible German tanks began to fall prey to the very terrain they had once mastered. The Americans, with their smaller and more maneuverable Shermans, adapted quickly. Instead of engaging the Germans in a head-to-head clash, they used their tanks' speed and agility to outmaneuver the Germans, striking from unexpected angles. The first cracks in the German myth appeared as the Shermans, despite their inferiority in firepower, began to take down Tigers and Panthers. The Germans had expected their heavy tanks to dominate, but the Americans used a combination of hit-and-run tactics, coordinated attacks with infantry and artillery, and superior mobility to counter the German advantage. The German tanks, once the kings of the battlefield, were now struggling to cope with the speed and adaptability of the American forces. The myth of their invincibility had already begun to fade, but it was in these moments that the German crews began to realize the full extent of their vulnerability. Inside the German tanks, the crews were accustomed to the overwhelming power of their machines. The roar of the 88mm gun was their weapon of choice, and the thick armor of the Tigers and Panthers gave them a sense of invulnerability. But as the battle in the Ardennes raged on, this sense of invincibility began to crack. When a Tiger tank was hit, the shock was palpable. The crew was trained to expect quick victories, to be able to destroy their enemies with ease. But now, as their tanks were being struck from unexpected angles, they were forced to reconsider their assumptions. The first shot that disabled a Tiger was a wake-up call, but it was not an isolated incident. As the battle continued, more and more German tanks were being destroyed or immobilized by the swift and relentless American attacks. The crews began to realize that their tanks were not the unstoppable juggernauts they had believed them to be. For the Americans, the changing tide of the battle was a moment of empowerment. They had long been told that their tanks were inferior to the German giants, but now they were proving otherwise. The Shermans, despite their thin armor and smaller guns, were proving to be more effective in the specific conditions of the Ardennes. The Americans had adapted quickly to the terrain, using the forests and narrow roads to their advantage. Their tanks moved with precision, flanking the German tanks and striking at their vulnerable spots. The presence of American infantry, artillery, and air support further added to the pressure on the German forces, making it even more difficult for the Germans to maintain their dominance. The German tanks, despite their legendary status, were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. The myth of the Tiger tank had been shattered on the battlefield as the Americans demonstrated that superior tactics and adaptability could overcome brute strength. The once proud German tank crews, now faced with a new kind of warfare, began to lose their confidence. The myth that had once given them an edge was now gone, replaced by the harsh reality of the battlefield. The collapse of the German tank myth did not happen in an instant. It was a slow and painful process, one that took place over days of fighting, as the Germans found themselves unable to match the flexibility and speed of the American forces. The Germans had believed that their heavy tanks could hold off any opposition, but now they were being outmaneuvered and outgunned. The psychological advantage that their tanks had once given them was slipping away, replaced by the realization that the Americans could and would fight smarter, not just harder. For the Americans, the collapse of the German tank myth was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one. The belief that the Germans had an unstoppable advantage in armored warfare had been shattered, and now the Americans had proven that they could hold their ground and even defeat the might of the German tanks. The success of the 761st Tank Battalion and the other American forces in the Ardennes was a testament to their ability to adapt and innovate in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans, who had relied so heavily on the myth of their tanks, were now finding themselves on the defensive, unable to sustain their once feared power. The collapse of the German tank myth was a turning point in the war. It marked the moment when the Germans lost their psychological edge in armored warfare. The Americans, through their innovation, adaptability, and relentless pursuit of victory, had proven that the myth of invincibility could be destroyed, and that even the most powerful machines could be brought down with the right tactics and determination. The Germans, once confident in their ability to dominate, now found themselves fighting a war they could not win. After the Battle of the Bulge, the aftermath was felt deeply on both sides. For the Germans, the immediate consequences were both physical and psychological. The retreat from the Ardennes marked a significant loss of territory and resources, but the real blow came with the destruction of their elite tanks. The Tigers and Panthers, once symbols of German armoured dominance, were now scattered and immobilised, unable to maintain their edge due to mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and the difficulty of operating in the harsh terrain. The belief that these tanks were invincible was shattered, and the German army found itself unable to replace their losses at the same pace the Americans could replace theirs. The psychological impact on the German forces was significant. The myth of the Tiger tank as an unstoppable force had long been a source of confidence for the Germans, but after their tanks were outmaneuvered, ambushed, and destroyed, this myth no longer held sway. German commanders, in the aftermath of the battle, acknowledged that the situation was not what they had expected. They had underestimated the adaptability and speed of the American forces. The Germans had relied on brute force, but it was clear that the Americans had found a way to exploit their tanks' weaknesses and make their superior numbers count. For the Americans, the victory in the Ardennes was a turning point. The 761st Tank Battalion and other U.S. forces had proven that their tanks could stand up to the Germans' elite armour. This success wasn't just about the battlefield, it was a powerful statement about American innovation, strategy, and resilience. The Americans had learned from their mistakes, adapted quickly, and exploited the Germans' vulnerabilities. The myth of the invincible German tank was no longer just a legend. It had been proven false on the battlefield. The immediate aftermath for the U.S. was a morale boost. They now understood that their tanks, though not as powerful as the Germans, could be just as effective if used with the right tactics. The battle had proven that the ability to adapt to learn on the fly was just as important as the raw firepower of any tank. The U.S. Army now had the confidence to continue pushing forward. They had broken the German tank myth, and in doing so had broken a significant part of the German will to fight. In the days and weeks that followed, the Germans shifted their tactics. Their heavy tanks, once considered their most powerful asset, were no longer the centerpiece of their strategy. They began to fight more defensively, relying on ambushes and infantry support, rather than attempting to overpower the Americans with their tanks. The loss in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the end for the German tank superiority. For the U.S., the victory would echo through the rest of the war. The lessons learned in the Ardennes would be used to shape future engagements. The battle proved that innovation and flexibility could overcome even the most formidable tanks. The loss of the Tiger tank's invincibility changed the course of tank warfare and would influence future armoured engagements throughout the remainder of World War II.